Today, we're diving headfirst into one of the most intensely debated, feared, and frankly, misunderstood prophetic figures in all of Christian history. We're going to unpack centuries of source material, dig into ancient biblical texts, and look at some pretty wild historical interpretations to unravel a mystery that has literally captivated millions of people. So, who actually is the Antichrist? For nearly 2,000 years, this single mysterious question has sparked endless speculation. When you hear the word, what comes to your mind? Is it some powerful political leader waiting in the wings? A master deceiver going to unite nations right before leading them into total destruction? Or is it possible this figure isn't a single person at all, but just a symbol for pure evil and opposition to God? Throughout history, countless world leaders have been accused of being the guy. But to truly understand why this figure is such a massive subject in biblical prophecy and Christian education, we really need to strip away all that pop culture sensationalism and just look at the texts themselves. To demystify all of this, we're going to logically walk through 5 key areas today. 1. Defining the Antichrist. 2. Biblical origins and prophecies. 3. The mark of the beast. 4. The history of false identifications. And 5. The real danger, which is deception. All right, let's jump right into part 1, defining the Antichrist. The word itself is actually really fascinating. It literally translates to against Christ or in place of Christ. And here's a surprising fact. While most people just assume the word is plastered all over the book of Revelation, the actual term Antichrist only pops up in the ancient letters attributed to John the Apostle. And in those specific texts, it refers broadly to anyone who denies Jesus, which, as you can imagine, introduces our first major historical debate. Because of this, there's a massive theological fork in the road within Christian traditions. On one side, you've got folks expecting a single future world ruler who's going to rise to power in the end times. On the flip side, many view the Antichrist not as one specific person, but as a recurring spirit or a pattern of opposition that we've seen again and again throughout history. But even with that divide, the historical consensus among believers really boils down to one central idea. This figure represents the ultimate opposition to the gospel truth. Moving right along to section 2, biblical origins and prophecies. If we look at the actual ancient texts, a huge piece of this puzzle comes from the second epistle to the Thessalonians. In it, Paul the Apostle describes this really mysterious figure that he calls the Man of Lawlessness. The text says this person is going to exalt himself, totally oppose God, and actually demand to be worshipped. A lot of historical and modern Christians connect this exact description straight to the future Antichrist. Others read it a bit differently, sure, but no matter what lens you're using, the underlying warning is crystal clear. It represents this peak moment of human pride and total rebellion against God. But the narrative gets even more complex when we flip to the final book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. This text introduces another intensely debated figure known simply as the Beast, who apparently holds immense global authority and influence. Now, because Revelation is apocalyptic literature, meaning it's absolutely dripping with heavy symbolism, it's led to a staggering range of interpretations over the centuries. Some traditions look at this and say, yep, the Beast and the Antichrist are the exact same future entity. Meanwhile, others view the beast as a symbolic representation of oppressive, evil political powers that just cycle through human history. Which brings us to section 3, the mark of the beast. Look, we simply can't talk about the beast without mentioning one of the most culturally famous concepts in all of prophecy. The text in Revelation explicitly associates your allegiance to this entity with a specific mark, and it introduces that infamous number, 666. Honestly, very few biblical ideas have generated more intense discussion, fear, and just widespread cultural recognition than this one single number. Now, because of all that symbolic language in Revelation we just talked about, interpretations here are wildly split. From a historical and educational standpoint, scholars point out that in ancient Hebrew numerology, which is a practice called gematria, the number 666 actually spelled out Nero Caesar, who was a very real, very terrifying first-century threat to early Christians. Fast forward to today, and some folks are expecting a literal physical mark in the future, like an actual ID system you'd need to participate in society. Others take it entirely symbolically, seeing it as a metaphor for giving your loyalty, your mind, and your actions over to corrupt, godless systems. All right, on to section 4, the history of false identifications. All of this ambiguity has basically fueled a frantic, centuries-long game of whodunit.
In the first century, terrified early Christians suspected oppressive Roman emperors like Nero. Skip to the 16th century, during the Protestant Reformation, and you had leaders like Martin Luther openly pointing the finger at the papacy. By the 20th century, global devastation had people suspecting modern dictators like Hitler or Stalin. And today, we're seeing those exact same ancient fears projected onto emerging technologies and big tech billionaires. But there's one common thread here. Every single prediction has proven 100% incorrect.
Because of this endless loop of failed predictions and mistaken identities, modern Christian leaders and educators are really pushing for a much more careful, measured approach to these texts. They heavily warn against all the sensational speculation. Instead of frantically trying to match up specific individuals with the daily news cycle, churches are increasingly telling folks to just stay humble and remain faithful no matter what the future actually looks like.
And that leads us into section 5, the real danger, which is deception.
Here's the really crucial takeaway from the texts. The true terror of the Antichrist isn't some kind of open, obvious hostility. It's deception. Just look at these characteristics. He isn't feared because he's a monster. He's feared because he's incredibly convincing. He doesn't show up and declare himself evil. Instead, he appears trustworthy, highly intelligent, and wildly charismatic. Prophecy says he'll actually solve major global problems, promise unprecedented peace, and unite deeply divided nations. The profound fear in Christian teaching isn't about being forced to follow him. It's that millions will willingly do it, because a deception that looks exactly like salvation is way more dangerous than obvious evil. So, to combat this ultimate deception, Christian churches urge believers to follow a few clear steps, rather than, living in a constant state of panic and conspiracy theories. First, to know their scripture thoroughly so they actually understand the genuine teachings of their faith. Second, to develop keen spiritual discernment so they can look past the shiny surface of things. And third, to absolutely avoid following charismatic personalities blindly, no matter what extraordinary claims they make or what earthly problems they seem to fix. At the end of the day, whether you view this figure as a future individual waiting to take the world's stage, a purely symbolic idea, or a recurring pattern of evil throughout human history, the core educational takeaway from these ancient texts is practically identical. The message is a call to trust God rather than live in fear. It's a directive to stay grounded, to keep your discernment sharp when faced with smooth-talking leaders, and to focus on living faithfully today instead of getting paralyzed by an obsession with predicting tomorrow. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. In our deeply human rush to try and identify the villains of tomorrow, are we losing sight of the truths and the discernment we're called to actually live by today? If the history of this prophecy shows us anything, it's that while the faces of power constantly change, the challenge to seek truth over a comfortable deception remains exactly the same. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.